Thank you. So there's lots and lots to say about this. Obviously, the three rather large events. It's a book that very much, I think there's, of the different ways you can tell this history, there's a way of doing it that's very like, and we all know what happened next. And there's a way of writing it as if you don't know what's going to happen next. And this is a book that very much felt in the latter category. So first, Simon, could you introduce your 6 journeys and 6 protagonists? Because obviously we know what the 3 countries are, but there's sort of 3 journeys in the places in question, and there's 3 journeys taken by people coming from outside to write about them. 2 of which I know well, 1 of which I don't know at all. So could you tell us what they are?
Yes, I can tell you what they are. Yes,
that's good.
So the 3 journeys by revolutionaries. The 3 revolutionaries are Lenin, Mao, and Fidel Castro. And the 3 revolutionary journeys are, firstly, Lenin's return to Petrograd from exile in Zurich in April 1917 aboard the so-called sealed train. For Mao, it's the Long March of October 1934 to 1935, which becomes a kind of foundational legend, really, in the formation of the People's Republic of China. And we've got Fidel Castro's return from exile in Mexico in early December 1956 aboard the Granma, this slightly rickety leisure yacht. And then the 3 other journeys are the journeys by the journalists, 3 American journalists who travel to Russia, China, and Cuba to report on these revolutions or these revolutionary movements. So John Reed travels from New York to Petrograd in the summer of 1917. It takes him a month to get from New York to Petrograd. He arrives just in time to witness the October Revolution. The second journalist is Edgar Snow, a Missourian who has been living in China for 8 or 9 years before he gets this brilliant opportunity in the summer of 1936 to travel to a communist-controlled area of China where Mao and his Red Army have relocated after the Long March. And he's the first Western journalist to travel to a communist-controlled area of China and report back. And then the third journey is, the third journalist's journey is Herbert Matthews of the New York Times, veteran war correspondent, highly respected journalist who in February 1957 gets this opportunity to be smuggled into the mountains, the Sierra Maestra Mountains, for a clandestine meeting with Fidel, who at the time the Cuban government is claiming he's been killed. And obviously he hasn't been killed. Matthews interviews him and writes it all up for a front page scoop on the New York Times, which is published on the 27th of February, the 24th of February 1957. And so, yeah, the 3 journalists are traveling, witnessing and reporting, and the revolutionaries are revolutioning.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that struck me about the book is it brings out quite a lot of the sort of distinctive sense of place and the differences between these 3 very different times and places. You know, the sort of northwestern Russia and St. Petersburg in particular, and Finland actually to a large degree in the 1910s, China in the 1930s, and also Shanghai has a sort of role before you coming to the Long March, and the Caribbean in the 50s. And so you sort of bring out a lot of details about this, some of which are stuck in my head quite a lot, like the regular sort of stops on the way of Lenin's sealed train as it kind of goes from Zurich north through north through Germany, up through Sweden, and sort of down through Finland. It's a very weird route, and sort of stopping on the way for, usually doing things they probably ought not to be doing, such as, hanging out with the Swedish workers' movement and so forth. So can you talk a bit about the sort of differences between those 3 places and times, because that kind of came out quite sharply.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because they're definitely very different places, and and contexts. And so for Lenin, certainly when he gets out of Germany and can move more freely, he's constantly trying to find out what's happening in Sweden, in Finland, with the workers' movements. He's usually in each town there's some reception that's been put on by the local mayor and trade union leaders, and he's preaching the gospel of world proletarian revolution. His comrades are usually eating the buffet and he's giving speeches. Lenin's giving speeches. And in a strange way, John Reed does the same one, because he makes this very similar journey up through Scandinavia down into Petrograd, and he's sort of in a different way, but similarly committed to global working class revolution. Is also very keen to kind of take the temperature of these movements. It's a time when I think they're thinking that there's a possibility of there being a more global proletarian revolution than turns out to be the case. In China, it is very different. Partly, the social structure of China is much more dominated by the peasantry, which is where Mao's big contribution comes in, because unlike many of his urban, educated, sophisticated comrades and rivals in the party, Mao's a peasant. He's a peasant. He believes in the peasantry.
Also, a big thing for Edgar Snow when he arrives to write about it. I mean, John Reed didn't have to have a load of inoculations before going to cover, the Russian Revolution, and obviously Edgar Snow made sure that he had. There's a little list, isn't there, of kind of like Maxwell House, ground coffee, fags. What was the other one?
Shaving foam.
Shaving foam.
Yeah.
Razor blades. Razor blades
yeah.
and shaving foam. And a load of inoculations.
Yeah,
so
he's
it's quite different.
He's still feeling pretty queasy on the train as he leaves Beijing to travel south. And I mean, the journey that Snow makes is very different. It's often the terrain is very foreign. It seems almost alien. It's a very different kind of environment to what's happening in Russia in 20 years earlier. Cuba's more fun, right? It seems more fun. I mean, it's not so fun if you're on the grandma, because it's a bit of a disaster and a lot of them get killed. But it's a kind of
despite the pile of Hershey bars that they're saved for the purpose.
Inadequate pile of Hershey bars, not enough. But that's a very different kind of environment. So, but I guess both the China and the Cuban ones, the revolutionary movements of their bases are not urban, right? They're based in the mountains or in the hills. Yeah.
There was various I thought it was quite subtle connections between the sort of revolutionaries, all three of the people making the kind of first journeys, the non-journalistic journeys, and I think the enormously striking thing is they were all revolutionaries first and foremost, before anything else. Very much people who regarded the point of being a revolutionary is that you make a revolution, and otherwise there's not. It's a rather pointless pursuit. And you bring out quite, how Lenin's kind of emergence and out of social democracy being very much as a kind of, because of the fact of his rejection of reform, and also of various kind of, other factors which we'll come to in a moment. But particularly this kind of rejection of sort of slow incremental reform through trade unions and the social democratic parties winning elections or what have you, and the concentration on revolution is what makes you a communist. And with Mao, you could have mentioned him being attracted to liberalism, attracted to anarchism, and really seeming to go for communism out of the thing of like which of these is the cudgel that you can wield in order to actually make a revolution properly. And this comes out especially with Castro because of the fact that if we believe our protagonist Herbert Matthews, and I think we should on this, Castro didn't go on the grammar as a communist.
No.
And what made him a communist rather was sort of, say, experiences of American foreign policy over the next few years. And maybe some persuasion, maybe liking Khrushchev, the various reasons. But he doesn't kind of start off as one. But the thing that makes him one, again, is this thing of like, if you're actually serious about a revolution, this is the kind of direction you have to go in. So you talk a bit about that and, how they sort of came to this particular position of, because obviously, the kind of standard way, particularly after 1989, of kind of understanding revolutionaries is ideology, first of all. They all have these kind of utopian, bizarre, freakish, stupid ideologies. And this leads them then to make a revolution in order to achieve their utopian blueprint. None of these three people have a blueprint. And in many ways, they're kind of improvising in order to do the thing they actually want to do, which is the revolution. And, after that, the next day the trouble starts, etc. But, can you talk a bit about that? Because it interested me a lot.
Yeah, I think that it's particularly striking with Mao and with Fidel, because Mao gets really attracted by anarchism. And, he kind of tries out anarchism. And he retains a kind of fondness for anarchism throughout his political career, really.
With mixed results.
Yeah, with mixed results, disastrous results. I don't know, but with results anyway.
Definitely with results.
And Fidel is not a communist in 1956 or in 1959. I mean, his brother is a communist. Raúl is a communist, but Fidel isn't. He's a Cuban patriot. He's a nationalist who wants. His great hero is José Martí, the 19th century anti-imperialist and Cuban nationalist, and Mao and Fidel, they both see their country as having been kind of weakened or humiliated to some degree by outside forces as well as internal weaknesses, and their main aim is to try to. They're driven by a sense of patriotism to make. I don't want to sort of channel Donald Trump, but to make China great again or to make Cuba great again, right? And so they are kind of motivated by that, and revolution in its various forms is the way that they set out about doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose also, particularly in the Chinese and Russian cases, you have them being preceded by quite ineffectual revolutionaries. Ineffectual isn't the right word of Chiang Kai-shek, but with Kerensky in Russia and the Russian Empire, and Chiang Kai-shek in China, come to power via revolutions of some kind, and quite quickly kind of make their peace with, the West, with kind of local, landowners, bigwigs, etc., the local armies, and obviously in Chiang's case, massacre hundreds of thousands of communists and sympathizers in the process. So that kind of sense of, the revolution has been sort of gingerly attempted by these people, and then they've kind of rown back on it. But our protagonists are much more kind of, all the wayers.
Oh, yeah, I know what I was going to say. They all of them benefit from the weaknesses of their opponents, right? So that's what struck me when you were talking about that. So, the provisional government, which is set up after the February Revolution in 1917, is from the start is kind of hobbled by the rival centre of power that are the Soviets, the workers and soldiers councils that spring up all over the country. So it's always having to kind of govern really with the permission, and increasingly the kind of veto power of the Soviets, particularly the Petrograd Soviet. At the same time, it's got this intractable problem about what to do about the war. The war's going badly, but there's great pressure not to. From Russia's allies to stay in the war, and gradually the thing starts to fall apart, and that gives the opening to Lenin and the Bolsheviks, right? In China, I mean, you could, yeah. I mean, Chiang does throw a lot at the communists to try to destroy them, and doesn't quite manage it.
Yeah, but I mean, it kind of emerging out of this. Obviously, I assume that Houseman's an audience reasonably familiar with the saga of the Chinese Revolution, but it is a kind of situation where there's a sort of series of failed revolutions. First in 1911, and there's the May 4th movement, and then there's the alliance between the Nationalist Party and the Communists, which obviously ends with Chiang Kai-shek massacring the communists. So there's this kind of long process of, and then there's attempts to kind of found a Soviet in Jiangxi, and it doesn't really. Again, they kind of get hounded out of there, and it's only really the failure of that brings Mao to the leadership, really. So it's this kind of long process of kind of failed attempts that lead up to it.
And I mean, Mao had been quite supportive of the alliance with the nationalists in the mid 1920s. And then Batista, he lets Fidel go. He says he sentenced to 15 years in prison. After 2, you're free. You can go. Pressured by the Americans, big mistake.
And that thing about the Americans, because the kind of, I think this comes out partly because the 3 journalists are all Americans, but also just so much of it seems to be about sort of particular breaks, what kind of leads someone to one sort of politics into another. And the thing that seems to have pushed all three of them into revolution and into communism seems in each case to have been a thing that's not happening within their societies as such, but a thing that's happening in the world that affects that society. So, for Lenin, the thing that kind of brings him out of kind of mainstream social democracy and his kind of previous kind of, fealty to people like Karl Kautsky and the German Social Democrats is the war. It's the First World War, and the kind of horror at the fact that the workers' movement in much of Western Europe just lines up and votes for this completely indefensible slaughter. Similarly with China, there's a kind of question of how it relates to imperialism and how it relates to as a country that was at that point, I think one could say semi-colonial. The big cities all more or less dominated by the West in one way or another, enormous amounts of resource being extracted from it, a country that very much been driven into poverty over the previous 100 years. And you kind of mentioned it sort of being a kind of making great, but there's also a feeling of, in relation to the world, that the Russian Revolution seemed like a power in the world that would emerge that wouldn't be colonial. The famous thing of the Bolsheviks coming to power and saying they're going to abandon all of the Russian concessions in China, which of course they don't actually do. But they promised to. And obviously in Cuba, the kind of interim point between them actually taking power and between them explicitly becoming communists is trying to do the things that that they think are part of their programs, which are nationalizing various American-controlled businesses and banks. And the reaction to that from the US and the kind of horror from the US to that, and then Khrushchev coming in and going like, we can help you out. It's a specific thing that pulls Castro where he goes. So they all kind of react. The thing that kind of make it's war and imperialism seem to be the kind of common things that kind of push them into these extreme positions, and that's it seems topical. So I'm kind of curious about that.
I mean they're all revolutions which are designed to attack or destroy imperialism. So Lenin's great hope in the autumn of 1917 is not that there's going to just be a proper, as he would say, a kind of proper socialist proletarian revolution in Russia, but it's going to affect the whole of Europe and perhaps even beyond. And it's the Great War which crystallizes that for him. For Mao in China, he sees that China's been weakened by European and American interference, colonialism, exploitation, and so part of the kind of the revolutionary project is to take on the imperialists, and that becomes a running theme throughout the Chinese, not just the revolution, but the revolutionary state and the People's Republic. It becomes an icon of or a leader of global anti-imperialism in the 1950s and 1960s. In a similar way to the role played by Cuba. I mean, the idea certainly for many Americans at the time that Cuba was a victim of American imperialism would have seemed alien, because America prided itself on its own anti-colonial kind of beliefs or supposed commitments, right? But Cuba was run as a de facto economic colony.
I mean, you mentioned it being in the constitution of Cuba, essentially, as an American veto.
Yeah, until the 1930s, when that's removed by under the Franklin Roosevelt administration. But even it's the American companies which control the Cuban economy, and when Fidel and his movement take power, they're determined not just to be kind of nominally independent. Fidel says at one point, it's very easy to kind of sing a national anthem and raise a flag, but you can't be politically free unless you're economically free. Yeah. And that sets him on a collision course with Washington, which it's always going to be hard to come to some accommodation with American business interests if you're fully committed to challenging. Yeah. And that clash ultimately pushes the Cuban Revolution towards an alliance with the Soviet Union, because that's the only way they can protect the revolution from an American-sponsored counter revolution.
Moving on to our three American travelers, they're all guys. They're all well educated. They're all kind of wasps of one sort or another. They're all quite a kind of American establishment group of people to one degree or another. Maybe Reed slightly less, but all three of them kind of, to a degree, are people who are. I suppose Reed was already known as a revolutionary when he went, and the other two very much not. And I think, Matthews, I don't think ever really did regard himself as a revolutionary in any way. But I'm kind of intrigued as to their motivations, what brings them there, and also what they find there. I was thinking a lot about an essay by the German poet Hans Magnus Enzensberger from the 70s called Tourists of the Revolution, which he wrote after a long spell living in Cuba. And he's basically like, we all want to go there and participate in the revolutionary process, and we can't because of the fact that we're, white, affluent Western tourists. And we can't get away from that, and there's no point in pretending that you can. And in Enzensberger's case, this brings them to a kind of gradual drift rightwards. But I'm kind of interested a bit in their tourism, and that they're kind of, and it being anticipatory, but also about what happens then to them when the revolution wins. And that Reed, and to a large degree, and also to a less degree Snow, throw themselves into it quite a bit and are very defensive of the new government and try to sort of help build the revolution in their own way.
Yeah, so Reed, John Reed, is he's lots of things. He's a bohemian, he's a poet, he's a radical journalist. He's been he made his name writing about U.S. labor disputes and the clashes between union activists and striking workers and big business, the Rockefellers and Carnegies literally the Carnegies and Rockefellers, and the use of police militia and extra legal violence against them, and he covers those events, and it's through that he really develops a affinity and sympathy with the American proletariat, the American working class, and the organised trades union movement, and his great the organisation that he kind of loves throughout the rest of his career are the Wobblies, the International Workers of the World, who he sees as not just fearless but also idealistic and romantic, and he kind of buys into their politics, the idea of organising all workers, not just the elites, organising everyone in industry, not just by craft, and in seeking to kind of build a new society within the shell of the old. So he's really captured by that. And then he goes and he covers the Mexican Revolution at a time when most Americans think it's just a bit of sort of comic opera revolution, right? And so he goes to Russia. He's initially skeptical about the February Revolution, thinks it's just a bourgeois, sticking plaster.
It would kind of help keep them in the war.
Yeah, but then increasingly is captured by the growing power of the Soviets and goes there to try to find out what's really going on. And after the revolution takes place in October, he basically becomes a Bolshevik. He works for the Foreign Ministry, for its International Propaganda Bureau. He eventually goes back to America and he helps found one of two communist parties that merge out of a split within the Socialist Party, and then that splits into two different communist parties. He goes back smuggles himself back to Russia, and until almost the end of his life, he seems pretty committed to the communist project. But his route there has been through witnessing and sympathising with the struggles of the
he's sort of participant observer in a way that the other two aren't.
He is. I mean, he's definitely a participant. He becomes a as I say, he works for the Bolshevik government
and ends up buried in the Kremlin War.
In the Kremlin Wars, yeah. For Snow and Matthews, I think their great motivation is adventure. They want adventure, and they become journalists, and they become war correspondents through their love of adventure. Right? They want to, the risks are part of the attraction. And for Matthews, the great turning point is the Spanish Civil War. He reports on Spain from the Republican side for I think 2 years. He's there, and like many journalists who go there, who report on the Republican side, he basically becomes a supporter of the Republicans. And I think in Cuba, he sort of sees echoes or resonances of the Spanish Civil War, but thinks this time the good guys might win. Yeah. And I think that kind of explains his reluctance to, as the Cuban Revolution drifts more towards communism and to closer alliance with the Soviet Union, he remains very reluctant to fully break from his earlier kind of full-throated endorsement. For Snow, his politics are on the left. He's a kind of democratic socialist on the American kind of spectrum. He's been in China for a long time. He's developed through reporting on famine and on floods and natural disasters and on the corruption of the nationalists. He's developed a real affinity and sympathy for the Chinese peasantry. And when he goes to visit this red area in Shanxi province around Yan'an and Bao'an, what he sees there, he kind of believes, right? He believes in it. He's touched by it, he's moved by it, and he says when he leaves, I've never experienced a people so happy and so free in all my life. Now, whether he was kind of, whether that was really how it was, but that's certainly how he came to feel about it. And so I think both for Matthews and Snow, they develop a real emotional connection to the stories that they've been reporting on, in a way that because Reed dies in 1920, he never has to deal with the distance, right? He never has to look back 10 years afterwards and reconcile what's actually happened with how it felt in October 1970.
I mean, you mentioned a lot of people sort of after his death trying to kind of claim him for some kind of anti-communism. He has doubts. He argues with the Comintern. I mean, the Comintern was arguing with itself every day, all day at that point. So it's rather anachronistic. But yeah, people sort of very much want to kind of take him out of it and go, well, of course he would have drifted away from it like we all did, but he purely conjectural. You're very kind of like, there's no real evidence of this at all. With Snow, there's a little footnote about him getting involved in communes, which intrigued me.
Oh yeah, this is during the Second World. Is this during the Second World War? It's like this attempt to kind of have like mobile industry to protect it from the Japanese, and industrial cooperatives basically, and an attempt to bring together workers, the bosses, kind of everybody in a kind of consensual kind of way to kind of operate these things on a kind of small scale, and so I think that gives an insight into the kind of politics that he was drawn towards. Really, I mean, it's I don't know how similar it is to the sort of West German model of bringing in workers onto boards, but it's an attempt to build a kind of a cooperative society.
But it's also very small scale, and I think that comes out a lot in the stuff on the Long March and on him visiting the base in Shanxi. Is this kind of it's a sort of village communism that he kind of finds there. You can't really imagine Warren Beatty and Diane Keaton there like you can in 10 Days to Ship the World. Obviously, Red's the film which I'm referring to, as mentioned in the book. Red Star Over China, it doesn't have that. You're not kind of wandering around a big European city being romantic. You're eating, you're eating rice in the fields, in the mountains. It's quite
a lot of boiled cabbage.
I'm loving a lot of boiled cabbage. Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a quite hard life, but it does seem to have been genuinely very, very egalitarian.
Yeah, it seems to be. Yeah, definitely the way that Snow sees it. It seems to be egalitarian. He talks about a relative lack of political violence and terror. I think that obviously there had been terror in the Jiangxi base and on the way there, but at this moment it's relatively terror free. I think because of where they end up, there aren't that many landlords to beat around the head, so that shapes it too. But yeah, I mean, he makes an effort to go and talk to ordinary soldiers and workers and peasants, and he's not constantly just talking to the leaders. And he is struck by the kind of society that he thinks is in embryonic form there in 1936.
I kind of like the fact that neither of them, none of the three, sort of end up, sort of disillusioned and kind of lamenting the follies of their youth, because obviously there's a lot of that about. But there is an element of like, I don't think any of the three of them were dupes, but they were obviously walking into a context of enormous amounts of propaganda. And I'm kind of curious to what the degree that you think they were conscious of writing propaganda and the degree to which they were propagandized. The example of that really comes across is in the account of Red Star Over China, which is, and this is not to denigrate the book, which I think is a wonderful book, but it's absolutely kind of co-production with the Communist Party, and very much a kind of, the entire event is kind of stage managed. The bringing him over, he mentioned him, literally being greeted with a big banner saying, welcome American journalist. And people like Zhou Enlai being very conscious of that. There's the wonderful moment of him sort of being approached by someone that suddenly asks him in English, "Are you looking for someone?" And of course it's Zhou Enlai. But that kind of thing of, again, I don't think of any of the three of them as naive, but one could make an argument for each of them kind of being willing to become part of a propaganda program of some sort.
I mean, they're all accused of being propagandists.
Of course.
I think, Reed wrestles with this in the preface to 10 Days, where he says, I'm no neutral observer, right? But I've tried to tell the thing with the eye of a conscientious reporter committed to the truth. And I think, he's giving you a sense of what it felt like to be on the streets of Petrograd in the autumn of 1917, through the eyes of someone who's sympathetic to that side of the argument, really. There are plenty of people who are probably terrified by what was going on in October 1917. But Reed isn't one of them. He's committed to that politics. But he's honest about it. And in some of the reviews of the book, that honesty is kind of praised because he's put his cards on the table, so you kind of know where he's coming from. He's not trying to pretend he's objective when he's not. But he's also very keen to draw on factual evidence, not on propaganda or rumour, but to, he collects this vast archive of newspaper reports and proclamations and posters, and makes all these detailed notes and uses that as the raw materials. Now, of course, the proclamations are part of a project to promote the Bolshevik Revolution, but in a way, there's no way around that, right? He has to deal with the materials that he has. I think Edgar Snow is deliberately. They want a journalist who's seen as independent. They don't want Agnes Smedley, who's a communist. Yeah. A brilliant journalist, a fellow Missourian like Snow, but someone who can be just dismissed. Oh, she's a communist. You can't believe what she says. They want Snow because he writes for articles which appear in the Saturday Evening Post. Right? He's kind of has a mainstream reach, and he's known as being independent and a person of professional integrity. And yeah, I mean, do they? Of course, they put on a show, right? They give him the best side of the story because they want him to relay the best side of the story. For specific events, the account of the Long March and the account of Mao's biography, particularly his early biography, Snow remains one of the most important sources for that because there are so few others. Exactly how much of what he was told is the truth, how much is embellished, is very hard to know, right? And with Matthews, I mean, he's not the first or the last to be taken in by Fidel's charisma and the force of his personality. And he's one of a series of American journalists. They're keen to get American journalists into the Sierra Maestra to report on the revolutionaries, to portray them in this as this kind of romantic outlaw band of kind of Robin Hood style revolutionaries. And Matthews is the first one, and so he's the one that cops all the flack when it goes when they embrace the Soviet Union. But he's not a propagandist. He writes honestly what he sees at the time. And Fidel makes his life difficult. I mean, they're kind of friends, right? But in 1959, when Fidel goes to America, he makes a big thing about how he'd have like 10 soldiers march around in a circle to trick Matthews into saying that there were hundreds of them. And Matthews is sat there in the front row, like looking a bit sick, and having to sort of say afterwards, "Oh, Fidel, he is a one.
He's a card.
For his sense of humour."
But that brings us to the sort of influence that the books have. I mean, they're influencing events and they're influencing each other. I mean, one of the things that's quite elegant in the book is each one sort of influences the next. There's people, in the 1930s in China reading 10 Days You Shook the World. There's people, in Cuba and in the kind of third worldist movements that Cuba inspires, reading Red Star over China. And, there's kind of process of the kind of ball gets kind of kicked along and then picked up and then kicked along and then picked up. But their influence on the events themselves, particularly in the case of Red Star over China and in the case of Cuba, interests me. But and the latter case, you have Guevara basically going like, more or less admitting, we were a bunch of chancers and he made us sound like the revolutionaries we really wanted to be, and that could have helped sort of spur them on to actually, be this thing. And there's a similar thing of lots of the battles described in Red Star over China being, somewhat less decisive, let's say, in the, in the story than they actually were. But the kind of, particularly when they come to power in 1949, it's the story. That version of the Long March becomes the particular story, and also its role in creating the personality cult of Mao, which doesn't really exist when he's writing it, and obviously by the 50s and even more by the 60s, it's enormous. Which I find kind of puzzling, because the Mao he's not unsympathetic, but he's pretty weird. He's asleep all the time.
He's asleep a lot in the mornings, and even in the afternoons. He's
this kind of like, of the three of them, sort of Lenin and Mao and Castro, he's by far the weirdest. He's kind of sleeping, and he's very oblique, and he's quite, He thinks
people should exercise naked.
Yeah. He's a prankster. I mean, Castro is obviously a prankster in a way as well, but he's one of the weirder ones. But he also comes across in the book as immensely heroic, with enormous probity and honesty and ethics and so forth, and enormous commitment. So, and he's put at the center of the story. He's kind of framed as, this is about the Lenin of China, who is Mao Zedong, not any of the other guys you might have heard of which there were a few. And this kind of puts him on the pedestal for the first time. Yeah,
and on that, I mean, Snow initially wasn't going to do that. He said he was going to edit the Mao story down, and his wife, Helen Foster Snow, who also went to Red China after her husband and interviewed leading communist figures, said, no, you've got to keep this in. You've got to keep the biography as told to you. Just don't change it. Keep it there. It's going to be the heart of the book. It's going to be what makes the book. And she eventually prevails on him to do that. And Mao is elevated by Snow in a way that he probably didn't necessarily deserve in 1936 or 37, because there were other, his position wasn't as kind of unassailable as it seemed. There were other rivals, there were other people that could have displaced him. His position wasn't kind of as secure as it seems, but the book certainly, by putting him at the heart of it, by putting his personal story at the heart of it, ends up contributing to that kind of legend.
And I imagine one of the things that makes that such a good editorial decision, even if not entirely a political decision, is that it is this tale of how someone becomes a revolutionary. How he goes through his experiences of, sort of through education, through kind of, not poverty by Chinese standards, but certainly poverty by American standards. His experience of sort of May the 4th and of, Shanghai and Beijing, and, that leading to this particular place. It's very much a kind of, revolutionary Bildungsroman at the kind of heart of it all. But the last question before I think you should then read a bit and then we'll have questions is, if you were to make such a journey to report on any revolution in the past or present, what would it be?
So you want me to go to create a new revolution where I can go?
That would be ideal. That would be my first choice. But as a historian, you're allowed to just pick one that's already happened.
Gosh, where would I go? I've long been a supporter of the secessionist movement in the Canary Islands. I think I'll go to the Canary Islands to report on the revolution.
Excellent. That's a good answer. Free Canaries.
Yeah. Free Canaries.
Will you read a bit of your book?
Yeah, I'm going to read just a short bit on Cuba. So this takes place just a few days after they've landed on Cuba, back on Cuba, on the Grandma, which is more of a sort of shipwreck than a landing. And anyway. With Batista's forces now hot on their tails, the rebels' only hope was to reach the Sierra Maestra mountain range to the east, whose high peaks offered relative sanctuary and a chance to regroup. The ragged band of revolutionaries pushed on, often marching at night to avoid the attention of spotter planes, sucking on sugarcane for sustenance and, occasionally, receiving help from local peasant families. But, as Che put it, these were truly terrible days. Malnourished, desperately thirsty, and suffering from fungal infections and painful open blisters, they were an army of shadows, ghosts. By the morning of Wednesday, the 5th of December, the party was on the verge of total collapse. Some men were fainting while others begged for rest. There was no choice but to stop. They had reached a place called Alegria de Pio, joy of the pious, nothing more than a small grove of trees, bordering a sugarcane field on one side and open to some valleys on the other, with dense woods starting farther back. Most of the men stretched out and slept. Later that afternoon, Che was leaning against a tree, chatting to a comrade and munching on a couple of crackers and half a sausage, when the first shot rang out. Betrayed by a guide who had left the camp earlier in the day, the compañeros found themselves under attack from Batista's troops. As fighter jets and B-26 Marauder bombers swooped low over the woods, strafing the rebel position, an infantry unit opened fire. Juan Almeida, Fidel's first lieutenant, bellowed out, "Nobody surrenders! Nobody surrenders!" and the rebels returned fire. One of the men, Universo Sanchez, described how in the confusion, the comrades started falling back toward a plantation that had been set afire by incendiary bombs. I had sores on my feet. I had taken off my boots, knapsack and bandolier. Pausing to sweep up everything, Sanchez lagged behind his retreating comrades, but eventually made it into the neighbouring cane field. If anything, the situation was now even worse, as, with Batista's soldiers now just 100 yards away, the hail of bullets went on, digging in the dirt around us. In the chaos, several revolutionaries were killed, and others scrabbled for cover. Wounded in the neck, Che returned fire with his rifle before dragging himself into the relative safety of an adjoining field. With many of the Grandma's landing party now either killed or captured, and the remainder scattered, the 26th of July movement's prospects looked pretty bleak. A news release, issued by the United Press, and based on information supplied by the Cuban military, reported that the rebels had been wiped out in a brief and bloody skirmish by aircraft and ground troops. This, together with the claim that the Castro brothers were among those who had been killed, received prominent play, including front-page billing on the New York Times, and for a time, the reports of Fidel's demise were widely believed. Although Fidel was still very much alive, the situation for the rebels was far from easy. For several days, Fidel himself commanded the grand total of 2 men, with just a couple of rifles and 120 rounds of ammunition between them. Much of their time was spent hiding in sugarcane fields, desperately seeking cover as low-flying jets strafed the area with .5 caliber machine guns, causing the very earth to shake. The only sustenance came from sucking on cane stalks and licking the morning dew from the damp leaves. Determined that he would not be taken alive, Fidel took to sleeping with the barrel of his rifle resting against his chin. Finally, with the assistance of sympathetic local peasants, who offered much needed food and fresh drinking water, and members of a network of farmers that had been recruited by Celia Sanchez, a formidable 36-year-old revolutionary with an unmatched talent for organisational efficiency, Fidel's party reached sanctuary. On the morning of Sunday the 16th of December, they arrived at Cinco Palmas, the home of a July the 26th movement sympathiser, which had been designated as a regrouping point in the event that the rebels became separated. 2 days later, Raúl arrived at the ranch. After embracing his brother, Fidel asked how many guns he had managed to save. The answer, it turned out, was 5. "Well," exclaimed Fidel, "we have 2. That makes 7. He was overjoyed. "Now," Fidel declared, "we've won the war."
Thank you.